A moment of forbidden touch shattered my resolve, pushing us both into uncharted territory that changed everything. I never thought a simple doctor's visit would change my life. I mean, whoever expects something life-altering from something so routine? But there I was, sitting in the waiting room, fidgeting with my phone, completely unaware that everything was about to take a wild turn. The dull hum of the fluorescent lights above and the muffled sounds of pages flipping in old magazines made the room feel unusually tense. But that's the thing about unexpected moments. They creep up on you when you least expect them. When my name was finally called, I stood up, forcing a nervous smile at the nurse as she motioned for me to follow her. The sterile smell of antiseptic hit me as soon as I stepped into the hallway. It was the kind of scent that always made me uneasy. As we walked toward the examination room, my mind was racing, trying to calm myself. It's just a checkup, I kept reminding myself. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. The doctor was waiting inside, a tall man in his mid-30s with a calm demeanor. His dark hair was neatly combed, and there was a professionalism about him that, in any other situation, would have made me feel completely at ease. But today, something felt different. He greeted me with a friendly smile, but there was something about his eyes, something that made my heart beat just a little faster. He gestured for me to sit down, and as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a routine visit. "So, what brings you in today?" he asked, flipping through my chart with a practiced ease. I stammered out something about feeling off lately, throwing in a few vague symptoms. Truthfully, I wasn't even sure why I was there. Maybe it was just nerves. Maybe it was something else. Either way, I felt like I was losing control of the situation. He nodded, not missing a beat. "Let's run a quick check. If you could undress down to your underwear, we'll get started." His tone was professional, but my stomach dropped as soon as I heard the words. I could feel my palms sweating as I stood up, fumbling with the buttons of my shirt, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this was standard procedure, something doctors did every day without a second thought, but something about it felt different. As I sat back down, shirt off, I felt exposed in a way I hadn't expected. I caught his gaze for just a moment before he quickly averted his eyes, focusing on the medical instruments laid out on the counter. But there was something there, something unspoken, something that sent a shiver down my spine. He ran through the usual checks, listening to my heartbeat, checking my reflexes. It was all so routine, but there was this tension in the air that neither of us could ignore. And just when I thought we were done, that the awkwardness would end, he cleared his throat. "I need to check something else. Could you, stand up for me?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, something I couldn't quite place. Without thinking, I did as he asked, standing up in front of him. My heart raced faster as I stood there, feeling his eyes on me, the weight of the moment heavy between us. Then he stepped closer, closer than I expected, and before I knew it, his hands were adjusting the waistband of my pants, his touch lingering just a moment longer than it should have. I froze. Everything inside me screamed to step back, to laugh it off, to turn the situation into something less intense. But I couldn't move. My brain was firing off 1,000 signals, telling me that this was just part of the checkup, but my body knew something else was happening, something I wasn't ready to admit. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the racing thoughts in my head. But the way he was looking at me now, the intensity in his gaze, it was impossible to ignore. His hand brushed against me again, and I could feel my face flush, my body reacting in ways I hadn't expected. There was no denying the chemistry between us, even if neither of us had said a word about it. And then, as if he realized the tension, he stepped back abruptly, clearing his throat once again. "That's all for now," he said, his voice a little too casual, like he was trying to brush off what had just happened. But I could see the look in his eyes. He felt it too. Whatever this was, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. As I hurriedly dressed, my hands trembling slightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just crossed some invisible line. The doctor turned away, pretending to organize his notes, but the energy in the room had shifted. There was something unsaid, something hanging between us that neither of us knew how to handle. I grabbed my bag and left the room, my mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. What had just happened? Was it all in my head? But I knew deep down that something had changed. The doctor's lingering touch, the way his gaze held mine for just a second too long. It wasn't just my imagination, but there was more. I could feel it. This wasn't the end of the story. Far from it. Whatever had started in that examination room was only the beginning. And as I walked out of the clinic, the air feeling heavy around me, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. I couldn't shake the feeling from that day at the clinic. It clung to me like a shadow, following me through every hour of my day, playing over and over in my mind. The doctor's hands, his eyes, the unspoken tension. It was like I was reliving the moment on a loop. Every time I thought about it, my heart would race just a little faster, and I'd find myself wondering, was it just a misunderstanding? Or was there something more behind that encounter? Weeks passed, and I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. After all, doctors are trained professionals. They see hundreds of patients every week. I had to be imagining the electricity in the air. But the more I thought about it, the less convinced I became. It wasn't just a routine checkup. There was something deeper, something that neither of us had acknowledged. And then, one day, out of the blue, I got a call. "Hello," I answered, surprised to see an unknown number flashing on my phone. "Hello, this is Dr. Hughes." His voice on the other end of the line sent a shockwave through me, pulling me right back into that moment in the clinic. "Hello," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the sudden rush of nerves. "Is something wrong?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "Nothing's wrong. I just wanted to follow up. You mentioned feeling off during your last visit, and I wanted to see if everything's okay now." I hesitated, caught off guard by his call. "Yeah, I guess I'm fine. Nothing major." But even as I said the words, I couldn't help but wonder why he had really called. There had to be more to it. "Well, that's good to hear," he said, but his voice had that same edge, that same undercurrent of something unspoken. "I, was thinking, if you like, maybe we could discuss things further. Sometimes it's helpful to talk things through outside of the office, you know?" My stomach did a flip. Was this what I thought it was, or was I just overanalyzing again? There was no mistaking the subtle suggestion in his tone, but I wasn't sure how to respond. "Outside of the office?" I echoed, my voice a little too high-pitched with surprise. "Yeah," he said, a little too quickly. "It's not, official or anything. Just casual. Maybe over coffee?" I froze for a moment, my mind racing. This was definitely crossing a line, wasn't it? Doctors don't just call up patients for coffee, but at the same time, I couldn't deny the thrill that ran through me at the idea. Yeah, sure. I guess that could be helpful," I found myself saying before I could stop. "Great," he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "How about tomorrow afternoon? There's a cafe downtown, just off Elm Street. It's quiet, not too busy. We can meet there around 3. I agreed, hanging up the phone with my heart pounding in my chest. What was I doing? This felt like dangerous territory, and yet I couldn't resist. There was something pulling me toward him, something magnetic and undeniable. The next day, I arrived at the cafe early, nervous energy making me fidgety. I scanned the room, half expecting him to back out at the last minute, but he arrived exactly on time. He walked in with the same calm, professional demeanor that I'd seen in the clinic, but there was something different about him now. Maybe it was the way he smiled when he saw me, or the way his eyes lingered a little longer than they should have. "Hey," he said as he sat down across from me, flashing me a smile that was almost too casual, like he was trying to play it cool but couldn't quite manage it. "Hey," I replied, my own nerves barely concealed behind a shaky smile. For the first few minutes, We made small talk. It was awkward at first, both of us skirting around the real reason we were there, but eventually the conversation started to flow. He asked about my life, my job, my hobbies, and for a moment it almost felt normal, like two people meeting for coffee, nothing more, but then the conversation took a turn. So, about that last visit, he said, his tone shifting, becoming more serious. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. I've been thinking about it. I know I crossed a line. It wasn't professional, and I should have handled it differently, but I can't stop thinking about it. His words hung in the air between us, thick with tension. I could feel my pulse quicken as his eyes locked onto mine, that same intensity from the clinic returning. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him that it was fine, that he was overthinking it. But the truth was I had been thinking about it too, more than I cared to admit. I don't know what to say. I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know this is complicated. I know it's not supposed to happen this way, but there's something here, isn't there, between us? I swallowed hard, my heart hammering in my chest. Maybe, I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop it. He stared at me for a moment, his eyes searching mine for some kind of answer, and then he reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. It was the same feeling I'd had in the clinic, the same unspoken connection. But now, here in the cafe, there was no denying it. I didn't pull my hand away. Instead, I let it linger, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. It felt like the whole world had shrunk down to this one moment, like nothing else existed outside of this cafe. Then he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I shouldn't be doing this, he said, his eyes full of conflict. I'm your doctor. This is wrong. I shook my head, feeling a strange mix of excitement and fear swirling inside me. But it doesn't feel wrong, I said, my voice shaky but firm. He let out a soft, almost resigned sigh, his fingers tightening slightly around mine. I know. That's what scares me. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. This wasn't just a casual flirtation. This was something much more dangerous, something that had the potential to unravel everything. But neither of us could stop it. The pull was too strong. Eventually, he pulled his hand away, leaning back in his chair with a heavy sigh. We need to be careful, he said, his tone serious. If anyone finds out about this, I know, I interrupted, my voice soft, but I can't pretend like there's nothing between us. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression torn. I can't either, he admitted quietly. The conversation hung in the air, unresolved and heavy with tension. We both knew what was at stake, but neither of us seemed willing to walk away. And as we sat there in that tiny cafe, the world outside feeling miles away, I knew this was just the beginning. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. But the truth was, I didn't care. Not anymore. The days after that cafe meeting felt like a blur, but the tension between us only grew stronger. Neither of us brought up what had happened during our conversation. In fact, we didn't speak for almost a week afterward. It was like we both needed time to process everything, to come to terms with the fact that whatever had sparked between us couldn't just be ignored. But the silence did nothing to quell the thoughts racing through my mind, and I knew, deep down, that this was far from over. It was a Wednesday evening when everything changed. I had just finished work when my phone buzzed with a message. My heart skipped a beat when I saw his name flash across the screen. I need to see you. There was no context, no explanation, just those 4 words. But it was all I needed to know that something had shifted. I stared at the message for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before I finally replied. Where? His response came almost immediately. My place. Tonight. I knew what this was, and I knew the risks involved. This wasn't just some harmless flirtation anymore. This was stepping into uncharted territory. But despite every logical thought screaming at me to stay away, to leave this whole thing behind, I found myself getting ready. Before I knew it, I was outside his apartment building, staring up at the windows and wondering what was waiting for me inside. When he opened the door, there was no hesitation, no awkward small talk. The tension that had been building between us for weeks was like a live wire, sparking the moment our eyes met. His apartment was dimly lit, the soft glow from a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. It felt like the world outside had disappeared, leaving just the two of us in this quiet, electric space. Neither of us spoke as he stepped aside to let me in. I could feel his eyes on me as I walked past, my heart racing with every step. The door clicked shut behind me, and suddenly, the air between us felt even heavier, charged with an unspoken understanding of what was about to happen. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said finally, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I didn't either," I admitted, my pulse pounding in my ears. "But I'm here." He nodded, his gaze intense as he took a step closer, closing the space between us. I could feel the heat of his body, the weight of his presence pulling me in. There was no turning back now. For a long moment, neither of us moved. It was like we were both waiting for something, caught in the pull of everything that had been left unsaid. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm. It was such a simple touch, but it sent a wave of warmth through me. And before I knew it, we were standing inches apart, the air between us thick with anticipation. "I've been thinking about you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me too," I confessed, my breath catching in my throat. And then, without another word, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in the softest, most tentative kiss. It was like the world around us slowed down, and for a moment, nothing else existed. The kiss was slow at first, hesitant, as if we were both testing the waters, but it quickly deepened as the tension between us reached its breaking point. His hand slid up to cradle my face as he kissed me, and I found myself melting into him, the weight of every unspoken word, every unacknowledged feeling pouring into that kiss. It wasn't just about desire. It was about the connection that had been building between us since the moment I stepped into his clinic. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more intense, and I felt myself being pulled under by the force of it. His hands were on my waist now, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from him as our bodies pressed together. My mind was spinning, caught between the overwhelming emotions and the physical sensation of being so close to him. I wasn't sure how we ended up on the couch, but suddenly, we were sitting side by side, our legs tangled together, the kiss never breaking. His hand moved to the back of my neck, his fingers threading through my hair, and I shivered at the touch, the intensity of the moment washing over me like a wave. Every brush of his lips, every soft sound he made sent another jolt of electricity through me, and I felt myself being drawn deeper and deeper into the moment. We pulled apart for just a second, both of us breathless, staring at each other like we couldn't believe this was really happening. His eyes were dark with emotion, and I could see the same conflict there that I had felt so many times. But there was something else, too, something undeniable. "I can't stop," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I don't want to stop." "Neither do I," I replied, and that was all it took. He kissed me again, more urgently this time, and I responded with the same intensity, the same need. It was like a dam had broken, and every ounce of tension that had built between us over the weeks came rushing out in a flood. I could feel his hands on me, pulling me closer, and I let myself get lost in the moment, the sensations, the heat of it all. The world outside didn't matter anymore. It was just us, here in this apartment, in this moment, where nothing else existed but the two of us. The boundaries that had once seemed so clear had dissolved, and now all I could feel was a closeness between us, the connection that had been simmering under the surface for so long finally coming to light. He broke the kiss again, his breathing ragged, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. "This is complicated," he murmured, almost to himself, but his hands never stopped moving, never stopped holding me close. "I know," I whispered back, my heart pounding in my chest, "but it doesn't have to be." His gaze softened, and for a moment it felt like the tension between us eased. But then, as if realizing the weight of the moment, he kissed me again, harder this time, more determined. It was as if he had decided that, no matter how complicated this was, he wasn't going to let it stop him, and neither was I. Our movements became more urgent, more desperate, as if we were both afraid that this moment would slip away if we didn't hold on to it tightly enough. The weight of the weeks of tension, the weeks of pretending that nothing was happening, pressed down on us, and I knew that this was the moment when everything would change. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, lost in each other, lost in the intensity of the moment. Every touch, every kiss felt like a release, like we were both finally allowing ourselves to feel what we had been denying for so long. It was overwhelming, and yet it felt so right, like this was exactly where we were supposed to be. At some point, we pulled apart, both of us breathless, staring at each other with wide eyes, the weight of what had just happened settling between us. He looked at me, his expression soft but full of emotion, and I knew that whatever came next, we couldn't go back to how things were. "This changes everything," he said quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself. "Yeah," I agreed, my voice barely above a whisper. "It does." We sat there in silence for a while, both of us processing what had just happened, both of us knowing that this was the beginning of something we couldn't ignore. Whatever came next, it was going to be complicated, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that after that night, nothing felt the same. The shift between us was undeniable, and there was no pretending that we could go back to how things were before. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to, but that didn't stop the questions from swirling around in my head. The what-ifs, the doubts, the nagging sense of unease that crept in during the quiet moments. We had crossed a line, and even though we had tried to push aside the complications, they were there, looming like a shadow we couldn't ignore. Days passed, and the messages between us became more frequent. It was like we had unlocked something neither of us knew how to control. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would leap in my chest, and I'd find myself eagerly waiting for the next time we'd meet. But beneath the excitement, there was something else, a tension that we couldn't shake. Neither of us talked about what would happen next or what this was becoming. It was like we were both too afraid to face the reality of it. Then, one evening, he invited me over again. This time, it wasn't with the same sense of urgency or need as before. It was different, calmer, almost hesitant. I could sense that something was weighing on him, but I didn't ask, maybe because I was afraid of the answer. When I arrived at his apartment, I could feel the shift in the air. He greeted me with a warm smile, but there was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. We sat together on the couch, the same spot where everything had started, but the atmosphere was different now, quieter, heavier. I could feel the unspoken words hanging between us, but neither of us knew how to begin. We talked for a while, about work, about life, about anything but the thing that was on both of our minds. But the longer we sat there, the more the tension built, until finally I couldn't take it anymore. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence that had settled over the room. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting slightly, as if he were searching for the right words. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I've been asking myself the same thing." There it was, the thing we had both been avoiding, laid out in the open for the first time. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for him to continue, unsure of what he would say next. It's not what I expected," he said finally, his eyes meeting mine. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen, but now that it has, I don't know how to handle it. I don't know what this is supposed to be." His words hit me like a wave, crashing over me with a force I wasn't prepared for. I had been so caught up in the intensity of it all, the thrill of what was happening between us, that I hadn't stopped to think about the bigger picture. What was this? Was it just a moment, Or was it something more? I don't know either, I admitted, my voice soft. Silence filled the room once again, and I could feel the weight of his words settling over me. This wasn't just about the two of us anymore. There were consequences, risks, things that neither of us had considered when we first gave in to the connection between us. And now, we were standing at the edge of something uncertain, something that could either pull us closer or tear us apart. I've been thinking about it, he said after a long pause, his voice quieter now, as if he were speaking more to himself than to me, about what this could mean for you, for me, for everything. My chest tightened as I listened, my mind racing with the possibilities of where this conversation was heading. I had known from the beginning that this wasn't going to be easy, but hearing him voice the doubts I had been trying to suppress made everything feel so much more real. I don't want to hurt you, he continued, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. And I don't want to make things more complicated than they already are, but I can't deny what I feel. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I had expected hesitation, maybe even regret, but hearing him speak so openly about his feelings left me speechless. But this isn't simple, we both know that. I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, leaning back against the couch, his expression conflicted. No, it's not simple, and I don't know how to make it simple. No matter how much I try to convince myself that this is too complicated, I can't let go of what we have. His words echoed in my mind, and I felt a surge of emotion rise in my chest. I hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected him to be so open about the feelings we had both been trying to keep at bay. But now that they were out in the open, there was no turning back. Neither of us had the answer, and yet neither of us was willing to walk away. It was a strange feeling, being caught between the certainty of our connection and the uncertainty of what the future held. But as I looked at him, at the way his eyes softened when they met mine, I knew that whatever happened, we had already crossed the point of no return. Finally, he broke the silence. I don't want to rush this. I don't want to make any decisions that we'll regret later. See where this goes? It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something, and in that moment it felt like enough. We weren't trying to figure everything out at once. We were just trying to navigate the uncertainty together, one step at a time. Okay, I said softly, the tension in my chest easing just a little. We'll take it slow. He smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. And for the first time that night, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Things were still hard, still uncertain, but at least we weren't facing it alone. We were in this together, whatever this was. As the night wore on, we talked about everything and nothing, about life, about work, about all the little things that made us who we were. It was like the heaviness of the past few weeks had lifted, replaced by a quiet understanding that we didn't have to have all the answers right now. All we had to do was take things one day at a time, and for the first time, that felt like enough.